When Detective Kyle Pemberton screamed, "You don't belong on that bench, you uppity bitch," before driving his boot into Judge Simone Langston's ribs in packed courtroom, that assault became the beginning of the end for a career built on lies and murder. Pemberton had no idea the woman he attacked had been quietly reviewing files that certain people wanted buried forever, including audio recordings about a case that destroyed families and covered up the execution of a black teenager. What started as routine criminal court became the spark that ignited a federal investigation exposing corruption at the highest levels. Watch till the end, because when the system tried to protect its own killer cops, the whole foundation cracked. The afternoon sun streamed through Courtroom 4C in Atlanta Metropolitan Justice Complex, where Judge Simone Langston reviewed a disturbing case file. 15-year-old Vanessa Richardson, charged with disorderly conduct by Detective Kyle Pemberton, the same detective whose name appeared with alarming frequency, always involving black teenagers, always with identical vague charges that criminalized normal behavior. Wait until you see what Pemberton confesses when he realizes who he's really dealing with. Judge Simone Langston had witnessed enough questionable arrests during her 20 years on the Atlanta Metropolitan Bench to recognize when something was fundamentally corrupt about a case. At 44, with 2 decades of navigating Georgia's complex legal landscape behind her, she possessed the kind of institutional memory that made disturbing patterns impossible to ignore. The file resting before her mahogany desk represented the 17th time in 18 months that Detective Kyle Pemberton had dragged a black teenager into her courtroom on charges that seemed designed more to intimidate families than to pursue actual justice. The charges themselves read like a masterclass in weaponizing subjective language against minority youth, displaying confrontational body language during lawful police interaction, using tone of voice indicating disrespect toward legitimate authority, and failing to demonstrate appropriate deference when given lawful commands by sworn officers. Each phrase represented a completely subjective interpretation that could transform any teenager's natural response to aggressive police questioning into legal grounds for arrest and prosecution. Vanessa Richardson sat in the front row of Courtroom 4C's gallery, her Grady High School blazer pressed and immaculate despite the circumstances surrounding her presence. Her hands remained folded in her lap with the careful composure of a child who had learned early that survival in certain situations required making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. The 15-year-old's dark eyes held a mixture of fear and determination that Judge Langston recognized from countless other young faces that had appeared before her bench, children forced to navigate a system that viewed their very existence as inherently suspicious. Sharon Richardson maintained one protective arm around her daughter's shoulders, while clutching a thick manila folder containing honor roll certificates, community service awards, and teacher recommendations. A portfolio of evidence documenting a teenager whose greatest transgression was waiting for public transportation while black in Detective Pemberton's patrol territory. The mother's composed exterior couldn't hide the exhaustion that came from months of fighting a system designed to criminalize her child's normal adolescent behavior. Judge Langston had been quietly documenting Pemberton's arrest patterns for the past 6 months, creating a private database that revealed the disturbing consistency in his reports. The language was remarkably similar across cases, as if generated from a template specifically designed to provide legal justification for the systematic harassment of minority youth. Marcus Williams, 16 years old, arrested for aggressive eye contact and clenched fists, indicating potential for violence toward officer safety. Destiny Parker, 15, charged with hostile facial expressions and failure to display appropriate respect during lawful questioning. Trevor Johnson, 14, detained for suspicious movement patterns and evasive responses to legitimate police inquiries. The pattern was not just unmistakable, it was methodical, systematic, and deeply troubling to anyone who understood that constitutional rights applied equally to citizens regardless of age or race. But what Judge Langston had discovered buried in the sealed administrative files would transform this routine juvenile hearing into the catalyst for exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of Atlanta's law enforcement establishment. Hidden in her private office safe were documents that revealed Detective Pemberton's most celebrated case. The shooting death of 16-year-old Quincy Johnson 2 years earlier had been built on lies, cover-ups, and the systematic destruction of evidence that would have proved the teenager was executed, rather than killed in self-defense. But what she had discovered in those sealed case files would change everything forever. The breakthrough in Judge Langston's investigation had come during one of her methodical late-night reviews of archived cases, when she discovered glaring inconsistencies in Detective Pemberton's most celebrated arrest, the fatal shooting of 16-year-old Quincy Johnson on March 18th, exactly 2 years and 3 months earlier. The official incident report had transformed Pemberton into a hero who neutralized an armed threat under extreme duress, earning him a formal commendation for valor under fire and a promotion to senior detective within the Northside Police District's Gang Suppression Unit. The official narrative painted a picture of split-second decision-making under life-threatening circumstances. An experienced officer confronting an armed suspect in a high-crime area, forced to use lethal force when the subject advanced aggressively with a weapon clearly visible. The department's public relations team had used Pemberton's quick thinking and professional restraint as an example of exemplary police work, citing his shooting as a textbook case of an officer protecting both himself and the surrounding community from imminent danger. But buried deep in the administrative files that most judges never bothered to review, Judge Langston had discovered Pemberton's original incident report, the one filed electronically at 11:43 p.m. on March 18th, exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes after he shot Quincy Johnson 3 times in the back. This preliminary document had been submitted before department lawyers and supervisors had time to review the circumstances, craft a more defensible narrative, and ensure that all potentially problematic details were either explained away or strategically omitted from the final version. The discrepancies between Pemberton's original observations and the final official report were not just significant, they were absolutely staggering in their implications. Where the official version stated, "Subject advanced aggressively toward officer position, with weapon clearly visible in right hand," Pemberton's initial notes read, "Subject appeared to be retreating when engagement began, no clear view of hands or potential weapons." The final report claimed, "Subject's firearm recovered 15 feet from body, consistent with dropping weapon while falling after impact," while the preliminary documentation noted, "No weapon found initially at scene, additional search of surrounding area required." Most damning of all, Pemberton's handwritten observations included phrases that had been completely eliminated from the official record. Unclear if subject posed immediate threat to officer safety. Subject appeared to be attempting to flee when shots fired, and no verbal threats or aggressive actions observed prior to engagement. These original assessments painted a picture not of heroic self-defense, but of a scared teenager running for his life before being shot down by an officer whose own initial observations questioned whether any threat had actually existed. The body camera footage from that night had been ruled inadmissible during the subsequent internal affairs investigation due to what supervisors described as technical difficulties with digital storage systems. The official explanation claimed that a software malfunction had corrupted the video files beyond recovery, making it impossible to review the actual events that led to Quincy Johnson's death. But Judge Langston had reason to believe, based on conversations with IT personnel who had since left the department, that the original recordings still existed in backup servers and that they would prove conclusively that Quincy Johnson was executed while attempting to surrender. The transformation of a frightened teenager running away from police into an armed aggressor threatening officer safety had been accomplished through what could only be described as the systematic falsification of evidence, coordinated at multiple levels of the police department's administrative hierarchy. Someone with significant authority and access had helped Detective Pemberton rewrite history, ensuring that a questionable shooting became a heroic act worthy of commendation and promotion. Judge Langston had spent countless hours comparing the documents, cross-referencing timestamps, and analyzing the language used in both versions of events. Her legal training and 2 decades of courtroom experience had taught her to recognize when testimony didn't align with evidence, but what she was looking at represented something far more sinister than simple inconsistencies or memory lapses under stress. What happened next would expose corruption reaching the very highest levels of Atlanta's police department. Detective Kyle Pemberton entered courtroom 4C with the unmistakable swagger of a man who had never faced serious consequences for his actions, despite 13 years of increasingly aggressive and questionable policing tactics. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the casual arrogance that came from operating within a system that had consistently protected and rewarded his methods, regardless of their constitutional implications or their impact on the families he targeted. His pale blue eyes swept the courtroom with practiced assessment, taking inventory of potential threats and challenges with the cold calculation that had become his professional signature. When his gaze lingered on 15-year-old Vanessa Richardson, there was something predatory in his expression, the look of someone who viewed black teenagers not as citizens deserving protection, but as problems requiring aggressive solutions. The slight smile that crossed his lips suggested a man who genuinely enjoyed wielding power over people who couldn't fight back effectively. When Detective Pemberton's attention shifted to Judge Langston, something more complex flickered across his features. Not quite open disrespect, he wasn't that foolish, but a subtle dismissiveness that conveyed his belief that black women in positions of authority represented temporary obstacles rather than legitimate threats to his methods. His posture straightened slightly, a military bearing that was designed to project competence and authority, but his eyes held the calculating look of someone already planning how to manipulate the proceedings to his advantage. "Detective Pemberton," Judge Langston began, her voice carrying the measured authority that came from 2 decades of commanding respect through demonstrated competence rather than intimidation tactics. "Please describe the specific circumstances that led to Miss Richardson's arrest on the evening of October 15th. Pemberton settled into the witness chair with the deliberate movements of someone claiming territory, his tactical gear creating the distinctive sound of leather and metal that reminded everyone present of his armed status. He was completely unaware that he was about to provide testimony that would not only destroy his career, but expose a network of corruption that had protected him throughout his rise through the department's ranks. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had testified in hundreds of similar cases, "I was conducting proactive community safety patrols in the Northside District when I observed a group of juveniles exhibiting behavior patterns consistent with criminal activity near the MARTA station at Peachtree Street and Fifth Avenue. Based on recent intelligence reports about gang recruitment and drug distribution activities in that specific area, I made the tactical decision to approach and conduct a community welfare check to ensure public safety and order." Judge Langston made careful notes as Pemberton spoke, her pen moving deliberately across the legal pad, while her mind processed the familiar euphemisms and coded language. Proactive community safety patrols was Detective Pemberton's preferred bureaucratic term for what civilian observers and community activists consistently described as the targeted harassment of teenagers whose only crime was existing in public spaces while black. The phrase "behavior patterns consistent with criminal activity" could apparently be applied to any group of young people who failed to display the immediate deference and submission that Pemberton demanded from the communities he policed. "How many juveniles were present during this initial observation, Detective Pemberton?" 6 individuals total, Your Honor. 5 males and 1 female, all appearing to be between the ages of 14 and 17, based on physical appearance and behavioral cues. The group was loitering in an area where loitering is specifically prohibited by city ordinance, and their body language and positioning suggested possible coordination for illegal activities. Yet only Miss Richardson was ultimately arrested and charged. Can you explain the reasoning behind that specific decision, particularly given that you've described the entire group as exhibiting suspicious behavior? For the first time since entering the courtroom, Detective Pemberton's confident demeanor showed a barely perceptible crack. He shifted slightly in the witness chair, perhaps unconsciously recognizing that his standard explanations were being subjected to a level of scrutiny that he wasn't accustomed to facing. His glance toward the prosecutor's table suggested he was expecting some form of support or intervention that wasn't materializing as expected. The other subjects immediately dispersed upon observing my patrol vehicle's approach to their location, Pemberton replied, his voice maintaining its practiced authority despite the slight tension that had crept into his posture. Miss Richardson, however, displayed specific behavior patterns that required additional intervention and assessment for community safety purposes. His next answer would reveal the racist thinking that had guided his entire career in law enforcement. Judge Langston set down her pen with deliberate precision and looked directly at Detective Pemberton, her dark eyes meeting his pale ones with the unwavering composure that had made her one of Atlanta's most respected jurists. The courtroom fell into an expectant silence as everyone present sensed that they were about to witness something significant unfold. Detective Pemberton, could you be more specific about these behavior patterns that you found concerning? What exactly did Miss Richardson do that differentiated her from the other 5 individuals who were allegedly engaged in the same suspicious activities? Pemberton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady as he delivered an answer that would expose 13 years of systematic racism disguised as professional law enforcement. She maintained prolonged and direct eye contact when I issued lawful commands for group dispersal, Your Honor. When I addressed her specifically about her presence in the area, she failed to immediately lower her gaze or demonstrate appropriate acknowledgement of my authority as a sworn peace officer. Her overall posture and demeanor remained confrontational and defiant throughout the duration of our interaction. The words landed in courtroom 4C like stones thrown into still water, creating expanding ripples of discomfort and disbelief that spread through the gallery. Sharon Richardson felt her daughter's hand tighten convulsively in hers, while several court observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they processed the stark reality of hearing a police officer testify under oath that he had arrested a 15-year-old girl for the crime of making eye contact with him during a public encounter. Detective Pemberton, Judge Langston continued, consulting her notes with the surgical precision of someone building an unassailable legal record. Are you testifying before this court, under penalty of perjury, that maintaining eye contact with a police officer constitutes disorderly conduct under Georgia state law? Pemberton's face began to flush slightly, but he pressed forward with the unwavering conviction of someone who had never been forced to examine or defend the fundamental assumptions underlying his approach to policing minority communities. In my professional experience, gained through 13 years of street-level law enforcement in high-crime urban environments, prolonged direct eye contact combined with defiant physical posturing can serve as reliable precursors to aggressive or violent behavior. We receive extensive training in recognizing these early warning indicators before situations escalate into threats against officer safety or public order. And in your professional opinion, Detective, what would constitute appropriate and acceptable behavior from a 15-year-old black girl during a police encounter in a public space? The question landed with devastating precision, forcing Pemberton into a position where he would have to either admit to applying unconstitutional standards based on race and age, or reveal the specific expectations and assumptions that guided his interactions with minority youth. His answer would provide a window into a mindset that viewed constitutional rights as privileges to be earned through displays of submission rather than protections guaranteed to all citizens, regardless of their age or color. The same behavioral standards apply to all citizens regardless of demographics, Your Honor, Pemberton replied, his irritation becoming more apparent as he was pushed to articulate positions that sounded reasonable in police briefing rooms, but became obviously problematic when stated explicitly in open court. Immediate compliance with lawful orders, respectful language and tone of voice, no challenging attitudes or confrontational body language. Any law-abiding person understands that following police instructions promptly and completely ensures everyone's safety and allows situations to be resolved efficiently. Judge Langston made another careful note, each question and answer methodically building toward a conclusion that everyone in the courtroom could feel approaching with the inevitability of a gathering storm. And Detective Pemberton, if a citizen, particularly a juvenile citizen, asks questions about the reason for a police stop or requests clarification about what they're being accused of doing wrong. Questions during active police encounters are frequently disguised attempts to argue with or challenge legitimate law enforcement authority, Pemberton said, his professional mask beginning to slip as his underlying attitudes became more apparent. A respectful and law-abiding person follows lawful instructions first and addresses any concerns or complaints later through appropriate administrative channels. Attempting to debate or negotiate with officers during street encounters creates unnecessary confusion and potential safety hazards for everyone involved. The answer revealed more than Pemberton likely intended, exposing a worldview where questioning police authority, even legal, constitutional questioning protected by the First Amendment, was inherently suspicious and deserving of punitive response. What Judge Langston revealed next about Quincy Johnson's murder would shock everyone in the courtroom. Judge Langston opened the thick manila folder that had been resting beside her gavel throughout the hearing, the simple action causing Detective Pemberton's confident expression to flicker with the first genuine uncertainty he had displayed since entering the courtroom. Inside were documents that would transform this routine juvenile hearing into the catalyst for the largest civil rights investigation in Georgia state history. "Detective Pemberton," Judge Langston said, her voice taking on a sharper edge that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter, "I'd like to discuss your encounter with 16-year-old Quincy Johnson on March 18th, 2 years ago. I trust you recall that particular incident?" The color drained from Pemberton's face with startling rapidity, his hands suddenly clenching into fists where they rested on the witness chair's armrests. The casual arrogance that had characterized his testimony up to this point evaporated completely, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of someone watching their most carefully buried secrets being dragged into the light of public scrutiny. "Your Honor," Pemberton said quickly, his voice carrying a desperate edge that hadn't been there moments before. "That case was thoroughly investigated by Internal Affairs and cleared through all appropriate administrative channels. I received a formal commendation for heroism under fire, and the shooting was ruled completely justified by every level of departmental review." "Yes, the final official report certainly does paint you as quite the hero," Judge Langston agreed, pulling out a document bearing official Atlanta Police Department letterhead and holding it where everyone in the courtroom could clearly see the departmental seals and signatures. "According to this final incident report, Quincy Johnson was an armed and dangerous suspect who threatened your life with a deadly weapon, forcing you to use lethal force in self-defense to protect both yourself and innocent bystanders in the surrounding area." Pemberton nodded eagerly, perhaps thinking he was being offered some kind of escape route from whatever legal trap was being constructed around him with methodical precision. "That's absolutely correct, Your Honor. The subject was armed with a handgun and advancing aggressively toward my position when I was forced to discharge my service weapon. It was a textbook defensive shooting that potentially saved multiple innocent lives by stopping a dangerous criminal before he could harm others." Judge Langston set the official report aside with deliberate ceremony and picked up another document, this one clearly bearing Pemberton's own handwriting, along with original timestamps and departmental filing codes that established its authenticity beyond any possible dispute. "That's very interesting, Detective Pemberton, because your initial incident report, filed just 4 hours after you shot Quincy Johnson, tells a completely different story about what actually happened that night." The courtroom fell into absolute silence as everyone present understood they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change their understanding of not just this case, but the entire system of law enforcement accountability in their city. Pemberton's face had gone completely ashen, his earlier swagger and confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed panic of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. "Your Honor," Pemberton stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, "preliminary incident reports are often inaccurate due to the extreme stress and confusion that accompanies critical incidents involving deadly force. The official investigation process exists specifically to correct those initial errors and establish the true facts of what occurred." Subject appeared to be retreating when engagement began. Judge Langston read aloud from Pemberton's original handwritten report, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent courtroom. "No weapon visible at time of first shot. Subject fell immediately after impact and remained motionless throughout remainder of encounter." The words hit the assembled crowd like physical blows, each phrase contradicting the heroic narrative that had earned Pemberton his commendation and promotion. In the gallery, several observers gasped audibly as they processed the implications of what they were hearing. That Quincy Johnson hadn't been threatening Detective Pemberton at all, but had actually been trying to run away when Pemberton shot him multiple times in the back. Judge Langston continued reading from the original report with prosecutorial precision. Subject was approximately 15 to 20 feet away from officer position and moving in direction away from engagement zone when shots were fired. No weapon recovered at scene during initial search. Unclear why subject was present in area at time of contact. What came next would destroy everything Pemberton thought he had buried forever. Detective Pemberton tried desperately to interrupt Judge Langston's methodical destruction of his fabricated heroism, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic as he watched 2 years of carefully constructed lies crumble before dozens of witnesses. Your Honor, those were preliminary observations made under extreme stress and life-threatening circumstances. The official investigation team corrected those initial errors and determined the true facts of what occurred that night. The official investigation was a systematic cover-up, Judge Langston said with quiet authority that carried absolute conviction throughout the courtroom. And you're about to discover exactly how extensive and coordinated that cover-up really was. She gestured to her court administrator, Maria Santos, who had been quietly setting up audio equipment at a side table throughout the hearing. The courtroom speakers crackled to life with the ambient sounds of a crowded restaurant or bar, clinking glasses, muted conversations, and background music that provided cover for the kind of private discussions that were never meant to be preserved for posterity. What this court is about to hear, Judge Langston announced, is Detective Pemberton's conversation with his immediate supervisor, Captain Preston Whitmore, recorded 3 days after Quincy Johnson's murder at Murphy's Tavern on Piedmont Avenue. This recording was obtained by someone who could no longer live with the conspiracy of silence surrounding this case. Pemberton was on his feet instantly, his professional composure completely shattered, as the implications of preserved audio evidence became clear. Your Honor, that recording was obtained without proper authorization. If someone has illegally accessed confidential departmental communications, then this entire proceeding is tainted by prosecutorial misconduct. The recording was voluntarily provided by someone who understood that protecting murderers makes you an accessory to their crimes, Judge Langston replied with devastating calm. Someone who realized that institutional loyalty has limits when it requires covering up the execution of children. The speakers filled courtroom 4C with the unmistakable voices of 2 police officials discussing murder and cover-ups as if they were routine administrative matters, requiring nothing more than proper paperwork and coordination between departments. Preston, Detective Pemberton's recorded voice said, slightly slurred with alcohol but unmistakably his own, I wanted to thank you personally for cleaning up that Johnson situation so efficiently. Some of the younger officers have been asking uncomfortable questions about my methods, and it's reassuring to know that command staff understands the realities of effective street policing. Captain Whitmore's gravelly voice responded with the casual authority of someone accustomed to making problems disappear through administrative manipulation. Kyle, you do whatever needs to be done to keep these streets safe and maintain order in our communities. The general public doesn't understand the harsh realities of urban law enforcement. Sometimes you have to send clear messages that will be remembered and respected. Pemberton's laugh echoed through the courtroom with bone-chilling cruelty as he celebrated the murder of a 16-year-old boy. That Johnson kid was absolutely perfect for sending that kind of message. Young enough to be intimidating to his peer group, cocky enough to need humbling, probably heading for serious trouble anyway based on his attitude and associations. His death taught every other potential troublemaker in the neighborhood exactly what happens when you don't show proper respect to police authority. The courtroom listeners sat in stunned horror as they heard 2 sworn law enforcement officers discussing the deliberate execution of a teenager as if it were a public relations strategy designed to terrorize an entire community into submission. Captain Whitmore's response revealed the institutional support system that had enabled Pemberton's crimes for years. The key is ensuring that all the paperwork tells a consistent and defensible story from the very beginning. As long as the official reports contain the right language about threat indicators and officer safety concerns, Internal Affairs will support our findings every single time without question. The recording continued with Whitmore providing specific instruction on how to manipulate incident reports to justify excessive force. Always include phrases like aggressive posturing and failure to comply with lawful orders. Those exact terms give review boards and prosecutors the legal language they need to rule any shooting as justified, even when the actual circumstances might be somewhat questionable to outside observers. Pemberton's recorded voice expressed genuine gratitude for this guidance in evidence fabrication. That's absolutely brilliant strategic thinking, Captain. I've been incorporating variations of those specific phrases into every single report I file. The real beauty is that you can apply those descriptors to virtually any behavior or response: eye contact, body language, tone of voice, walking pace. It becomes impossible for anyone to prove definitively what a subject's actual posture or attitude really indicated in the moment. If you believe that justice should be blind to color but never blind to truth, type justice below. As the devastating audio recording continued to expose the systematic nature of the corruption that had protected Detective Pemberton's crimes, the courtroom's rear doors opened with deliberate timing to admit 3 individuals in dark federal suits. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful, suggesting law enforcement professionals who had been anticipating this exact moment for months. The lead figure, a stern-faced woman with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding significant authority, approached Judge Langston's bench with federal credentials already prepared for inspection. Her presence transformed what had been a local juvenile hearing into something with national implications and federal jurisdiction. "So, Your Honor," the woman announced in a voice that carried absolute professional authority, "I am Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. We have federal warrants for Detective Kyle Pemberton's immediate arrest on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal civil rights statutes." Detective Pemberton looked around courtroom 4C with increasingly wild eyes, perhaps only now beginning to understand that his verbal assault on judicial authority had been witnessed not just by local court personnel and community members, but by federal law enforcement officials who had been building a comprehensive case against him for months. The realization that he had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap was written clearly across his face in expressions of disbelief, rage, and growing terror. "This is impossible," Pemberton whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's ventilation system. Internal Affairs cleared every case. The district attorney's office reviewed all the evidence. I followed departmental protocols and procedures exactly as I was trained. Agent Martinez approached Pemberton with handcuffs already prepared, her expression maintaining professional neutrality despite the obvious gravity of the charges she was about to file. "Detective Kyle Pemberton, you are under arrest for multiple violations of federal civil rights law. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court proceedings." The audio recording that had been playing throughout this exchange reached an even more damaging section, where Captain Whitmore could be heard providing specific instructions on how to coordinate cover-ups across multiple departments and agencies. "The trick is making sure everyone tells the same basic story," Whitmore's recorded voice explained, with the casual expertise of someone who had orchestrated numerous cover-ups. "Internal Affairs, the District Attorney's Office, even the medical examiner's reports, they all need to support the same narrative about threat assessment and justified use of force. As long as we control the initial information flow, we can shape how every subsequent investigation unfolds." Pemberton's recorded response revealed just how extensively the conspiracy had operated. What about the body camera footage? Some of the younger officers are asking why the video always seems to malfunction during critical incidents. "Technical difficulties are unfortunately common with complex digital systems," Whitmore replied, with practiced bureaucratic language. "Storage corruption, software incompatibilities, hardware failures. There are dozens of legitimate reasons why video evidence might be incomplete or unavailable for review. The important thing is documenting these technical issues properly in the official reports. As Agent Martinez began reading Pemberton his complete Miranda rights, the continuing audio revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond individual officers to include systematic manipulation of evidence at multiple levels of Atlanta's law enforcement and judicial hierarchy. Someone with significant access and authority had been coordinating efforts to ensure that questionable shootings were transformed into heroic acts worthy of commendation and career advancement. "How many departments are involved in your investigation?" Judge Langston asked Agent Martinez during a brief pause in the recording. "Our current investigation encompasses 14 separate police departments across 7 states," Agent Martinez replied, her words causing audible gasps throughout the courtroom. "We have documented evidence of over 200 officers who have either participated directly in civil rights violations or enabled those violations through administrative cover-ups and evidence manipulation." The scope of the federal investigation was staggering, suggesting that Detective Pemberton's methods had been shared through informal networks of police trainers and supervisors who viewed his approach as a model worth replicating in their own jurisdictions. Detective Pemberton's psychological collapse accelerated as he realized that his exposure in Judge Langston's courtroom was just one small part of a massive federal operation that had been documenting crimes and building cases across multiple states for an extended period. His violent reaction to this realization would seal his fate forever. Detective Pemberton's face cycled rapidly through a spectrum of emotions as the full scope of his situation became undeniable. From pale shock to flushed rage to the ashen pallor of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. His hands were trembling now, 13 years of carefully constructed lies and institutional protection crumbling before dozens of witnesses who would ensure that his crimes could never again be hidden behind administrative bureaucracy. "This is all a setup," Pemberton screamed, his voice rising to a level that made court security officers tense for immediate action. This entire hearing was orchestrated to destroy a good cop who wasn't afraid to do what needed to be done to keep dangerous criminals off the streets. Agent Martinez continued reading his rights with professional calm, but her partner had moved to a position where he could intervene quickly if Pemberton's psychological breakdown escalated into physical violence. The federal agents had clearly dealt with similar situations before and recognized the warning signs of someone preparing to lash out with desperate fury. "Detective Pemberton," Judge Langston said, her voice maintaining the steady authority that had characterized her handling of this explosive situation from the beginning, "the only person who destroyed your career was you. Every confession we've heard came from your own mouth. Every piece of evidence was created by your own actions." Pemberton's response revealed the complete depth of his delusion and the racist worldview that had driven every aspect of his policing career. "You people always twist everything to fit your narrative. You always make it about race when it's really about respect and maintaining law and order in communities that don't understand civilization." The phrase "you people" sealed his fate, removing any possibility of claiming that his words had been misunderstood or taken out of context. Judge Langston had heard this exact language before from officers who viewed their badges as licenses for unchecked power rather than symbols of public service and constitutional duty. "You want the real truth?" Pemberton continued, his voice cracking with years of suppressed hatred finally finding expression. "Fine. I'll give you the goddamn truth about what it's actually like policing these neighborhoods where nobody understands respect or authority." The courtroom fell into tense silence as everyone present understood they were witnessing the complete psychological collapse of someone whose entire professional identity had been built on lies, violence, and institutional racism disguised as legitimate law enforcement. "These people don't understand anything except force," Pemberton screamed, spittle flying from his mouth as he pointed directly at the gallery where Vanessa Richardson and her mother sat in stunned silence. "They think they can walk around with attitude problems and challenging looks disrespecting authority, and we're supposed to just take it like we're social workers instead of cops." Judge Langston remained behind her bench with unshakable composure, her dignity providing a stark contrast to Pemberton's unraveling sanity. She had seen enough racist breakdowns during her career to recognize that the mask was finally coming off completely, revealing the ugly reality that had always lurked beneath Pemberton's professional facade. That Johnson kid got exactly what he deserved for walking around my beat like he owned the place. Pemberton snarled, his face twisted with savage satisfaction at the memory of murdering a 16-year-old boy. Probably dealing drugs or planning some gang initiation, definitely heading for prison or worse anyway. I just saved society the trouble and expense of dealing with another career criminal. The confession was complete and damning, delivered before multiple federal agents and dozens of witnesses who would ensure that Pemberton's own words would be used to convict him of murder and civil rights violations. His psychological collapse had provided prosecutors with evidence that would have taken months to develop through traditional investigative methods. "Detective Pemberton," Judge Langston said, rising slowly from her chair with the deliberate movements of someone asserting moral authority over a situation that had spiraled into chaos. Quincy Johnson was employed at the Northwest Community Center, where he tutored younger children in mathematics and reading. Vanessa Richardson maintains a 3.8 grade point average and volunteers at the local food bank every weekend. Neither of them were criminals. They were children whose only crime was existing while black in your patrol area. Pemberton's final response would cross every line of courtroom decorum and human decency, sealing his fate with an act of violence that would be remembered as the moment when institutional racism finally revealed its true face in the most public and undeniable way possible. The tension in courtroom 4C had reached a breaking point that everyone present could feel in the air itself, like the electric charge that precedes a lightning strike. Detective Pemberton stood less than 8 feet from Judge Langston's bench, his face cycling through expressions of rage, desperation, and calculated malice as he processed the complete destruction of everything he had built through 13 years of systematic abuse disguised as law enforcement. "So you think you're untouchable up there behind that fancy robe," Pemberton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. "You think that piece of cloth protects you from the real world, from the consequences of destroying good cops who are actually trying to make a difference in these communities." Agent Martinez had moved closer to Pemberton's position, her hand instinctively drifting toward her service weapon as she recognized the body language and vocal patterns of someone preparing for explosive violence. Her 23 years of federal law enforcement experience had taught her to identify the warning signs that preceded complete psychological breakdowns, and every indicator was flashing red as she watched Pemberton's mental state deteriorate in real time. "Detective Pemberton," Judge Langston said, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority despite the obvious physical threat posed by his proximity and increasingly erratic behavior. "You will address this court with appropriate respect, or you will be held in contempt of court in addition to the federal charges you're already facing. Your career is finished. Your crimes have been exposed before the entire community, and your freedom is about to end permanently." Pemberton's response was a harsh, bitter laugh that contained no humor, but boundless hatred for everything that Judge Langston represented in his twisted worldview. "Make it worse? Lady, you just destroyed my entire life based on some edited recordings and conspiracy theories cooked up by bleeding heart activists and federal bureaucrats who've never walked a beat in their comfortable lives." The court security officers had begun moving toward strategic positions around the courtroom, understanding that Pemberton's military training, combined with his desperate psychological state, made him extremely dangerous to everyone present. But Judge Langston raised her hand slightly, a gesture that stopped them from intervening prematurely, while she continued to handle the situation with the calm authority that had defined her entire judicial career. "How you think I have anything left to lose?" Pemberton continued, taking another step toward the bench in a movement that was clearly intended to be intimidating and threatening. "You think destroying a cop's reputation and career matters, when you've already made it impossible for me to work anywhere in law enforcement again?" The courtroom gallery had gone completely silent, with parents instinctively pulling their children closer, while other observers sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether they should flee or remain witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential violence, as everyone present understood they were watching a man who had nothing left to lose confronting a judge who refused to be intimidated. "You know what your real problem is?" Pemberton snarled, his voice rising again as he allowed years of suppressed racist hatred to pour out without any remaining filters or professional constraints. "You people think you're equal to us now. You think wearing a judge's robe or a fancy suit changes what you really are underneath all that legal education and political correctness." The silence that followed was electric with tension, everyone in courtroom 4C understanding that Pemberton was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, about to commit an act that would destroy him completely and irreversibly, while providing the final piece of evidence that federal prosecutors would need to ensure he never saw freedom again. "You think that bench makes you better than cops who actually risk their lives every day to protect ungrateful communities from their own worst elements?" Pemberton continued, his movements becoming more agitated and threatening with each word. "But I know what you really are, just another uppity—" "Detective Pemberton," Judge Langston interrupted with steel in her voice, rising to her full height behind the bench and meeting his hatred with unwavering dignity. "You are addressing a federal judge in a court of law. You will show appropriate respect, or you will face additional federal charges for threatening a judicial officer." But Pemberton was beyond rational thought now, consumed by the kind of rage that had been building for years and was finally finding expression in the most destructive way possible. His next words would be the last coherent statement he made as a free man. "I think it's time someone taught you what real authority looks like," he said, with the flat conviction of someone who had made a decision that couldn't be undone. The assault happened with shocking suddenness, despite everyone's anticipation. Pemberton's right leg swung in a vicious arc, his tactical boot connecting with Judge Langston's midsection, with enough force to lift her slight frame completely off her feet. The impact sent her crashing backward into her chair, with a sound that echoed through the marble courtroom like thunder, the violence of the attack stunning everyone present into momentary silence. Judge Langston absorbed the devastating blow with the same composure she had maintained throughout the hearing, her dignity intact, even as she doubled over in obvious pain. Even in that moment of physical assault, she refused to give Pemberton the satisfaction of seeing her broken or defeated, her eyes never closing, her judicial authority never wavering despite the attack on her person. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Agent Martinez drew her weapon, while court security officers rushed Pemberton from multiple angles. Spectators screamed and dove for cover, while court personnel activated emergency protocols designed specifically for catastrophic breakdowns of order like the one they were witnessing. Pemberton stood over Judge Langston's fallen form like a conqueror, surveying his victory, his face twisted with the savage satisfaction of someone who had finally expressed his true nature without restraint or consequence. "That's what happens when you forget your place and try to destroy people who are actually making a difference," he snarled, his words carrying throughout the courtroom despite the chaos erupting around him. But his moment of triumph was brief and ultimately meaningless. Agent Martinez's voice cut through the noise with sharp federal authority. "Kyle Pemberton, you are now under arrest for assault on a federal judicial officer, a felony punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison. Stories like this prove that courage can triumph anywhere in the world. Comment your country and city so we can see how far this message of justice and dignity is reaching." Security officers swarmed Detective Pemberton with professional efficiency, wrestling him to the polished marble floor despite his attempts to resist arrest. The man who had entered courtroom 4C with swagger and untouchable confidence was now face down on the cold stone, federal handcuffs cutting into his wrists, while a dozen witnesses documented his complete psychological and professional collapse through cell phone cameras and court recording equipment. As Pemberton was restrained and his Miranda rights were read for the second time in 10 minutes, Agent Martinez coordinated with her backup team through subtle hand signals that indicated a much larger operation was already in motion throughout Atlanta. The assault on Judge Langston had been the final piece of evidence they needed, but it was only the beginning of what would become the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in the southeastern United States. "Your Honor," Agent Martinez said, approaching the bench while keeping her weapon trained on Pemberton's prone form, We've been conducting a parallel federal investigation into Detective Pemberton's activities and his network of enablers for the past 14 months. What happened here today provides the conclusive evidence we needed to move against his entire conspiracy. Judge Langston slowly pulled herself upright, with the assistance of her court administrator, her face pale but her expression unchanged despite the visible bruising where Pemberton's boot had connected with her ribs. The red mark was already beginning to darken, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. Let the record reflect that Detective Kyle Pemberton has physically assaulted a sitting federal judge in open court before multiple federal witnesses and dozens of civilian observers. Agent Martinez's radio crackled with updates from other federal teams deployed across the city. Command, we have Captain Whitmore in custody at his residence. Lieutenant Cartwright is attempting to destroy evidence at headquarters, but is contained. We've seized approximately 600 case files and 23 computer hard drives from the Northside District. The scope of the simultaneous operation was staggering, suggesting months of careful planning and coordination between federal agencies. This wasn't just about prosecuting individual officers for civil rights violations. It was about dismantling an entire network of corrupt police officials who had been systematically abusing their authority while enjoying administrative protection from their supervisors and colleagues. As Pemberton was hauled to his feet by security officers, his face cycling between rage and panic, as the reality of his situation became completely undeniable, additional federal agents entered the courtroom carrying briefcases full of evidence and electronic equipment that would be used to document every aspect of the day's proceedings for later prosecution. "This is all because of that one punk kid," Pemberton screamed as he was led toward the courtroom doors, his voice echoing off the marble walls where he had once strutted with unquestioned authority. "Everything was fine until you people started stirring up trouble and making problems where none existed." Judge Langston felt a cold satisfaction as she watched Pemberton's worldview crumble in real time, understanding that his words were providing prosecutors with additional evidence of the racist motivations that had driven his crimes throughout his career. For 13 years, he had terrorized black youth with the confidence that the system would protect him from consequences. But now that same system was turning against him with the full force of federal law enforcement. "Detective Pemberton," Judge Langston said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom despite her obvious physical discomfort, "Quincy Johnson was not one punk kid. He was a 16-year-old honor student with a family who loved him, a job he took pride in, and a future that you stole from him through premeditated murder. And now you're going to face federal justice for that theft." Agent Martinez's radio continued providing updates on the expanding federal operation. Multiple arrests confirmed across 7 precincts, Captain Morrison from Eastside District in custody, Lieutenant Rodriguez from downtown attempting to flee but intercepted, evidence seizure operations proceeding on schedule at all target locations. The coordination was impressive, demonstrating that federal investigators had been building comprehensive cases against multiple officers and supervisors simultaneously while waiting for the right moment to move against the entire network. Pemberton's assault on Judge Langston had provided that moment, triggering arrests and evidence seizures that had clearly been planned and rehearsed for months. As Pemberton was finally removed from the courtroom, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls, where he had once walked with the confidence of someone who believed himself above the law, Judge Langston understood that they had witnessed something larger than one man's downfall. They had seen a system finally holding itself accountable, choosing justice over institutional loyalty, when the two came into direct conflict. The federal investigation's scope continued to expand as Agent Martinez briefed Judge Langston on the full extent of what had been uncovered. "Your Honor, our investigation has identified a network of corrupt officers spanning 14 police departments across 7 states. We have documented evidence of systematic civil rights violations affecting over 300 families, with financial damages exceeding $50 million. The numbers were staggering, representing years of systematic abuse that had been hidden behind administrative bureaucracy and professional courtesy between law enforcement agencies. Pemberton's methods hadn't been isolated incidents of individual corruption. They had been part of a coordinated approach to policing that viewed constitutional rights as obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to be protected. "How many officers are involved in the total investigation?" Judge Langston asked, still processing the implications of what Agent Martinez was describing. "Currently, we have federal warrants for 217 officers, supervisors and administrators," Agent Martinez replied. "The charges range from civil rights violations and excessive force to conspiracy, murder and racketeering under federal RICO statutes. We're treating some of these departments as criminal organizations that used their law enforcement positions to commit ongoing crimes against constitutional rights." The transformation of Detective Pemberton from local police officer to federal criminal defendant represented something much larger than individual accountability. It marked a fundamental shift in how federal authorities would respond to systematic abuse of power by law enforcement agencies that had been operating with impunity for decades. What happened in the months that followed would transform law enforcement accountability across the entire region. 6 months after Detective Pemberton's violent assault in Courtroom 4C, the federal prosecutions were delivering justice with surgical precision that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. The trials had become a masterclass in how federal civil rights law could be used to hold corrupt officers accountable when local systems failed to protect citizens from systematic abuse. Detective Kyle Pemberton himself had been convicted on 19 separate federal charges, including deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, assault on a federal judicial officer, and racketeering. The federal judge who sentenced him specifically noted that his assault on Judge Langston demonstrated an absolute rejection of the rule of law and constitutional government that strikes at the heart of our democratic system. The sentence was life in prison, without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Pemberton would never again have the opportunity to abuse his authority or terrorize innocent families. As he was led away in federal shackles, his final words to the court were a bitter complaint about political correctness destroying real police work, confirming that he had learned nothing from his exposure and conviction. Captain Preston Whitmore, the supervisor who had orchestrated cover-ups and evidence manipulation for years, received 47 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy. The judge in his case noted that supervisors who enabled and protected corrupt officers bore even greater responsibility than the individual perpetrators because their actions made systematic abuse possible on a large scale. Lieutenant Owen Cartwright, who had been caught destroying evidence during the federal raids, was sentenced to 32 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. His attempts to eliminate computer files and physical documents had been futile, since federal investigators had been monitoring electronic communications and had backup copies of everything he tried to destroy. The sentences were making headlines across the country, serving notice to corrupt officers everywhere that federal authorities were serious about prosecuting civil rights violations and that institutional protection could no longer shield them from consequences. Legal experts described the Atlanta prosecutions as a watershed moment that would fundamentally change how police misconduct cases were investigated and prosecuted. Mrs. Eleanor Johnson, Quincy's mother, had become the symbolic face of the federal civil rights case, her quiet dignity and persistent demands for justice inspiring similar families across multiple states to come forward with their own stories of police abuse. Standing outside the federal courthouse after Pemberton's sentencing, she spoke with the composed authority of someone who had transformed personal tragedy into systemic change. "My son Quincy was murdered by a man who thought black children's lives were worthless and disposable," she said, her voice carrying to the crowd of supporters who had gathered to witness this historic moment of accountability. "But his death was not meaningless if it prevents other mothers from experiencing the pain that our family has endured for the past 2 years." The federal investigation had ultimately identified 63 families whose children had been victimized by Pemberton's network of corrupt officers, each receiving substantial financial settlements from the cities and counties that had employed the convicted officers. More importantly, they received official acknowledgement that their children had been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them from harm. Vanessa Richardson, now 16 and thriving in her junior year at Grady High School, had become a powerful advocate for police reform and youth rights. Her experience in Judge Langston's courtroom had taught her that speaking truth to power was not just possible, but essential for creating lasting change in communities that had been systematically oppressed. "I used to be afraid of police officers," Vanessa said during a speech at the National Youth Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C. "Now I understand that good officers want the same thing we do: safe communities where everyone is treated with dignity and respect regardless of their race or age. The bad officers were afraid of us because they knew we could expose their lies if we had the courage to speak up." The Atlanta Police Department had undergone complete restructuring under federal oversight, with new leadership recruited from outside Georgia to ensure that the culture of corruption and racism that had protected officers like Pemberton could never take root again. Body camera policies were revised to prevent the kind of technical difficulties that had allowed murderous officers to escape accountability for years. New training protocols emphasized constitutional rights and de-escalation techniques, while community accountability measures gave civilian oversight boards real power to investigate misconduct complaints without interference from police administration. The changes were being studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as a model for comprehensive police reform. But perhaps the most significant transformation was cultural rather than administrative. The recognition throughout Atlanta's black communities that silence in the face of injustice was no longer necessary or acceptable. Citizens had learned that good people had not just the right, but the moral obligation to speak truth to power, regardless of the personal cost or professional consequences. Maria Santos, the court administrator who had preserved and presented the evidence that destroyed Pemberton's career, was promoted to Director of Court Security for the Northern District of Georgia. Her courage in exposing corruption had prevented dozens of other families from experiencing the tragedy that befell Quincy Johnson's loved ones, and her new position gave her the authority to protect judicial proceedings from corrupt law enforcement interference. Detective Lisa Chen, the internal affairs investigator whose secret recordings had provided crucial evidence against the conspiracy, was appointed as the first civilian director of police accountability for Fulton County. Her new role included authority to investigate misconduct complaints without interference from police administration, marking a fundamental shift in how law enforcement agencies would be held accountable for their officers' actions. The ripple effects of the Atlanta prosecutions extended far beyond Georgia's borders, inspiring federal civil rights investigations in 17 other states and leading to the conviction of over 400 corrupt officers who had been operating with similar impunity in their own jurisdictions. The Department of Justice announced the creation of a permanent civil rights task force with dedicated resources for investigating systematic police corruption. The memorial garden planted outside the courthouse would become a symbol of hope for families seeking justice. 2 years after the assault that echoed through the halls of justice and changed the course of civil rights enforcement in America, Judge Simone Langston received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. Eleanor Johnson knocked softly on the door, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the peaceful expression of someone who had found closure after years of grief, struggle, and ultimately vindication. "Judge Langston, Mrs. Johnson said, settling into the chair across from the mahogany desk that had become famous as the place where institutional racism had finally been forced into the light. "I wanted to thank you personally for having the courage to stand firm when it mattered most. Quincy's death finally has meaning because you refused to let Pemberton hide behind his badge and his lies." The package contained a framed photograph of Quincy Johnson at his high school graduation ceremony, smiling with the bright optimism of a young man who believed the future held unlimited possibilities for someone willing to work hard and treat others with respect. Beneath the photo was an engraved brass plaque reading, "Justice delayed is not justice denied, when good people decide to speak truth to power." Judge Langston felt tears gathering in her eyes as she studied Quincy's face, seeing in his expression the same dignity and hope that she had witnessed in countless young people who had appeared in her courtroom seeking protection from a system that too often failed them. His murder had been a tragedy, but his legacy had become a catalyst for changes that would protect future generations. The federal consent decree governing police departments throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area had become a model for law enforcement reform nationwide, with provisions requiring implicit bias training, community oversight, transparent investigation of misconduct complaints, and real consequences for officers who violated citizens' constitutional rights. Crime rates in formerly over-policed neighborhoods had actually decreased as community trust in law enforcement was rebuilt through accountability and mutual respect. Most importantly, young people throughout the region no longer lived in constant fear of police encounters. The systematic terrorization of black youth that had characterized Pemberton's approach to law enforcement had ended, replaced by community policing models that emphasized protection and service rather than intimidation and control. Keisha Williams, Vanessa Richardson's younger sister, had just been accepted to Howard University on a full academic scholarship, where she planned to study criminal justice and civil rights law. In her scholarship application essay, she wrote about the day in Courtroom 4C that had changed her understanding of power, courage, and the possibility of creating change through individual action. "I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear," Keisha had written. "Courage is doing what's right even when you're terrified of the consequences. Judge Langston showed me that one person willing to stand up against injustice can change everything, for everyone who comes after them." The scholarship fund established in Quincy Johnson's memory had provided educational opportunities for over 300 young people who had been victimized by police misconduct, transforming trauma into opportunity and ensuring that corrupt officers' attempts to destroy futures had instead created pathways to success and achievement. Judge Langston kept Quincy's photograph on her desk as a daily reminder that justice work required both professional competence and personal courage, that every case that came before her bench was an opportunity to either perpetuate systematic failures or create space for healing and accountability. The bruises from Pemberton's assault had long since faded, but the memory of that moment remained vivid, not because of the violence, but because of what it had represented about the choice between dignity and retaliation. The courthouse steps where Mrs. Johnson had once stood alone, demanding justice for her murdered son, while facing skepticism and bureaucratic indifference, now hosted regular community meetings where residents worked collaboratively with reformed police officials to build trust and prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished in darkness and silence. Detective Kyle Pemberton was serving his life sentence in federal prison, his days spent in protective custody away from the general population that included many of the young men whose lives he had destroyed through false arrests, fabricated charges, and systematic harassment. His name had become synonymous with police corruption in criminal justice textbooks, a cautionary tale taught to every new law enforcement recruit about what happened when officers forgot their oath to serve and protect all citizens equally. But Judge Langston's legacy was entirely different. Her name was spoken with reverence in communities that had learned to trust the justice system again, in law schools where students studied her techniques for confronting institutional racism, and in courtrooms across the country where other judges found courage to challenge corruption rather than enabling it through silence or indifference. The lesson was simple but transformative. Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred and violence is simply refusing to be broken by it, standing firm in principled positions until truth prevails, and choosing to remain in places where difficult work matters most, rather than seeking personal advancement or safety in more comfortable positions. As evening fell over the courthouse where so much healing had begun, Judge Langston prepared to leave for home, where her husband waited with dinner and stories of his own day saving lives as a trauma surgeon at Grady Hospital. The work would resume tomorrow and the day after that, and for as many days as children and families needed someone to stand between them and those who would abuse positions of authority. Pemberton's assault had been intended to silence Judge Langston, to put her in her place, as he had intimidated so many others throughout his career. Instead, it had become the moment when his entire world of lies and violence collapsed, when the system he had corrupted finally turned against him with the full force of federal law and constitutional principle. The most important lesson from this story was that lasting change begins with one person deciding that enough is enough, that some principles are worth defending regardless of personal cost, and that justice, while sometimes slow, moves inevitably toward truth when good people refuse to give up or step aside. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared their locations from around the world. Your global support for truth and accountability means everything. If these stories of courage inspire you, please subscribe to join our community of people who believe in standing up for what's right. Until next time, remember that one person's refusal to stay silent can change everything.